Okay, well, welcome everyone to the Irish American Heritage Museum and another talk with our fantastic historian, Damian Shiels. Damian is one of the hardest working historians I think I've ever seen and talked to. He's both historian and an archaeologist. He has lectured for us previously on the American Civil War and the Irish pension files. So he does a huge amount of work on social and military history and now conflict archaeology. He was a curator at the National Museum of Ireland, and where he was part of a team that designed and prepared an award-winning exhibition on soldiers and chiefs. He established and runs the amazing IrishAmericanCivilWar.com website. It's gone beyond a blog. I don't know how you ever had the time to do it. He's affiliated with the university there in Northumbria. He has a Civil War Blue Jackets project, which he'll talk to us about a little bit later on, and another day we'll have him back to give a presentation. But today we're having him talk about the archaeology of battle sites and trying to piece together Ireland's troubled war history with the very famous Vinegar Hill during the 1798 rebellion. So take it away, Damian. We're delighted to have you back, and thank you for joining us.
Thanks a million, Elizabeth. It's great to be back with the Irish American Heritage Museum. I'll just try and share this screen now. Never any pressure with intros like that. It's a super intro. Can you see that? Or okay, yeah,
we can. You're perfect. That's great.
Brilliant. That's great. So yeah, this is, as the line goes, now for something completely different on the American Civil War correspondence. It is, as you were saying, my kind of other hat, the conflict archaeology of battlefields in Ireland, which is something I've worked quite a lot on. And specifically today, I wanted to talk to everyone about the archaeology of two sites of the 1798 rebellion, the 1798 rising of the United Irishmen, specifically Vinegar Hill, but also some analysis that we conducted at the Battle of New Ross, also in County Wexford. And so I'll begin by giving a small bit of a background about the 1798 rebellion, in case anyone isn't aware of kind of the headline details in relation to it. I also, because obviously I'm all about the American links, so some revolutionary links to this rising and the United States, and some of the consequences that also play into the United States. And then we'll take a very brief overview of conflict and battlefield archaeology in Ireland, the analysis of these sites from an archaeological perspective, and then look at battlefields as landscapes and the sites themselves. So it does look like we'll be here for about 5 days based on the preliminary slide, but I promise we won't be. I'll try and fly through it. But the 1798 rebellion itself has a bit of a debt, I suppose you could say, to the American Revolution. But it is primarily the French Revolution that inspires a group of, if you like, disaffected, largely Presbyterian men to form the Society of United Irishmen in 1791. And they are effectively looking for increased, if you like, equality for themselves within the British Kingdom, the Kingdom of Ireland. It's kind of run completely by Protestants at that point in time, and Presbyterians, like Catholics, are largely excluded from significant sections of society. And so they form this Society of United Irishmen in 1791, very much being inspired by the events in France of only a couple of years previously during the French Revolution. And it grows into what is genuinely a multi-denominational society, an organization that brings both Presbyterians and Catholics together in these organizations around the country. But as Great Britain begins to go to war with revolutionary France in the 1790s, the United Irishmen are increasingly driven underground. And they become, as a result, increasingly revolutionary in their own aims. And they begin to actively seek to create a republic. And if you look at a lot of the events of the Irish War of Independence in the 20th century, which I know you've had talks on, and all of the later events in the 19th century, such as the Fenian Risings, these Irish Republicans, these Irish nationalists consistently hark back to 1798 as almost their starting point. It's kind of the origin story for a lot of 19th and 20th century Irish nationalism. And so the United Irishmen decide that they will have a rising. And this map here, taken from Roots Web, gives you a bit of an idea of some of the main events. It's a nice little map. There were failed efforts to bring the revolutionary French onto the island in 1796. You can see down here in Bantry Bay in the southwest of Ireland, a fleet of thousands of Frenchmen got to within literally a few hundred meters of the Irish shore, but were unable to land due to adverse weather conditions and had to withdraw. And this, to be quite frank about it, terrified the administration in London, who began to significantly invest in defending the Irish coast. They started to crack down on United Irishmen groups in and around the country, try and get them to hand over weapons, etc. And so this was the state of play when May 1798 comes around, which is the month that the full rising occurs. Unfortunately for the United Irishmen, they were fairly heavily infiltrated by informers, and a number of their leaders. The rising was to commence in Dublin. A number of their leaders, such as Lord Edward Fitzgerald, were arrested almost immediately, and it meant that the rising was largely abortive in many locations, and it was very sporadic. So initially in places like Meath, here in Kildare, there was rising of local United Irishmen groups. It was set up on the basis of local units rising. Locals would rise in their areas. Unfortunately, as Meath and Kildare rose, they were rather quickly defeated, the United Irishmen there on their own. But the main crux of the 1798 rebellion, where it becomes most famous, is down here in Wexford, and it must be said, often forgotten, into South Wicklow. And here the United Irishmen succeeded in largely taking over the entire county, and they had a few early wins. They defeated militia units and tried to push further into Wicklow and into neighbouring counties, in neighbouring County Kilkenny and Carlow, and effectively managed to control the county for a period of a few weeks. But ultimately, as other risings were defeated around the country, the government was able to concentrate its forces on Wexford, push into it, and fight a, if you like, decisive battle at Vinegar Hill, which is the most famous battle of the 1798 rebellion. There were other elements to it. There were risings in Antrim and Down, and there were also, after most of these risings had been put down, another French force landed in August of 1798. So May and June sees much of the fighting in the east. In August 1798, a small French force lands at Killala Bay. Some initial victories, such as the battle known as the Races of Castlebar, but ultimately defeat for them as well. And it leads to the suppression of the United Irishmen's goals, if you like, in an Irish context. Soon would follow the Act of Union, mass arrests, mass killings, and a mass exile. And I suppose that's a very brief overview of the rising itself. But I do want to talk about these pre and post American links. It's particularly interesting from the side of the government forces who were fighting at places like Vinegar Hill, that many of these places knew places like New York State very well. They had fought there during the American Revolution. And this just gives you, General Gerard Lake was the commander of the forces, the British forces at the Battle of Vinegar Hill. He fought in the Carolinas. He was at Yorktown. Francis Needham was one of the main commanders at Vinegar Hill. He was at Yorktown. Henry Johnson was at Vinegar Hill. Again, the Virginia, the Carolinas, and Yorktown. Loftus was Vinegar Hill. And General Sir John Moore, who should have been at Vinegar Hill, only he got caught fighting another battle just about a day's ride away, was also there. Charles Cornwallis needs very little introduction to anyone who's into their American Revolutionary history, and he is the head honcho in Ireland in this period as well. And the leader of the United Irishmen has a really interesting history. Lord Edward Fitzgerald, who is shot actually as he's arrested in the 1798 rising, had served with the British military as aide-de-camp to Lord Rawdon in the Carolinas. He has a very interesting backstory in relation to being wounded in 1781 in that he was rescued by an enslaved man, this man, Tony Smalls, who then became great friends with him and came to Ireland and lived with him in Dublin and spent the remainder of his years in Ireland. So we have these cross-Atlantic links tying the 18th century United States and colonies as it was before with the 1798 rebellion. And it's something that is a significant postscript, this international postscript, because the United Irishmen didn't go away. Those who survived, many of them found themselves all over the world. Some of them ended up fighting, effectively being sold into the Prussian military, fighting during the Napoleonic Wars. Some of them are then subsequently captured by the French and become part of the French Legion. Huge numbers of them go to the United States and Canada, but to the United States particularly, so much so that there's a great book, if you ever wanted to read a good book on the War of 1812, the war, of course, in which the White House was burned. I might recommend this book by Alan Taylor, but you'll see his subtitle here is American Citizens, British Subjects, Irish Rebels and Indian Allies. And the Irish rebels he's referring to there are men who had fought and women who had been involved in the 1798 Rising. Vinegar Hill in itself was such a consequential battle for the Irish that it became a name that is now all over where the Irish diaspora went. And there are numerous instances of it in the United States. So if you ever come across a Vinegar Hill in the United States, it's almost always named after this battle in County Wexford in June of 1798. This is the, if you're crossing the Brooklyn Bridge in New York, you come down and they have little signs marking the different neighborhoods in Brooklyn, and there is the Vinegar Hill neighborhood marked, again, a reference to the battle. Some of the United Irishmen were deported to Australia, and a few years later, a battle was fought, a small rising was fought in Sydney in 1803, and was often called the Battle of Vinegar Hill locally because of its involvement with the United Irish involvement in it. In an American context, certainly there were Vinegar Hills in places like Richmond. Often they became, after they were Irish areas, African American areas. There's at least 2 instances of that in the United States. As the Irish move up and out, African Americans move in. So really interesting links across the Atlantic, both before and after, which, given my interests anyway, and I'm sure the interest of a lot of you is always nice to bring out. Conflict archaeology in Ireland, then, appropriate maybe to just have a quick look at some of that. Battlefield and conflict archaeology is a subdiscipline of archaeology that really started in the United States with the work that was carried out at the Little Bighorn, Custer's last stand. And in effect, it brings archaeological techniques to these sites to try and determine what archaeology can tell us that perhaps the history books can't. History records can often be patchy. They can leave significant details out, but the archaeology tends not to lie. If there is material in the ground, it's going to tell its own story. And a number of sites have been looked at over the years. The Battle of the Yellow Ford in County Armagh, Dr. Jim O'Neill and Paul Logue looked at this site. This was the heaviest defeat of an English army in Irish history, when Hugh O'Neill's forces defeated Henry Bagnall during the Elizabethan 9 Years' War. Kinsale, County Cork in 1601 is a site that myself and my colleague Paul O'Keefe have investigated extensively across the course of almost 20 years. A major siege site and the area where the Irish were, if you like, defeated in the 9 Years' War. There's also been some work at the Boyne, 1690 site. This is at King William and King James. Aughrim in 1691, largely regarded as the bloodiest battle in Irish history. And of course, Vinegar Hill. And the work we'll be talking about at Vinegar Hill is the largest to date. It has the most significant results. It was the most extensive that's yet been carried out. Most of these many of them have been voluntary efforts, small scale. Aughrim, for example, was when the roadway was going through there. But other types of archaeology are things like looking at the Martello Towers, these towers that were built by the British around the coast of Ireland to try and defend it from potential French invasion. This is a site I worked on with colleagues in Rubicon Heritage, and this is the remains of a gun platform constructed in the 1790s. And it's kind of difficult to see here, but if you see where this is etched out, this is actually the gun would have as I accidentally press the wrong button, the gun would have swiveled along this line, firing out over Bear Haven, which then, as now, is a important harbour and anchorage. It goes all the way up to World War I and World War II and 1916 and the War of Independence, etc., which I won't go into in too much detail, but sure, we can come back and talk about the War of Independence stuff some other time. A lot of what we know from an archaeological perspective generally about Irish battlefields grew out of a project that I managed the archaeological element of, and colleagues at Enniclon managed the historical portion of for the Irish government back in 2006 and 7, when we attempted to identify all the battlefields that could be located on the island of Ireland. A huge project, one of the largest of its kind ever undertaken. We were looking for every battlefield that could be pinpointed from the 8th to the 18th centuries. And there was a big concentration of the later periods, because the very early battles, such as those, for example, that occurred during the Viking period, the Irish annals, for example, would tend to tell you about 55 things about the person who died there, but are not great on actually locating it within the environment for you. The later battles give us descriptions that allow us to pinpoint certain fields, certain roads, certain rivers, that will give us a hint at the archaeology behind them. And so we tend to look at these battlefields as landscapes from an archaeological perspective. Just a quick image there on the right. This is probably my favorite location relating to a conflict site in Ireland. It was where General Sir John Moore, if any of you have ever been to Edinburgh, there's a big statue of him there. He dies fighting the French in Spain in the retreat from Corunna, but very famous British general. And he was fighting in Wexford in 1798, and he was encamped at a place called Longgrave House. And on the morning of the Battle of Foulkes Mills in 1798, he marched his entire column down this avenue to the battlefield. And it's an avenue that, if you go back, is overgrown. It's got these fantastic trees either side, and it just has an incredible sense of history about it. You can almost hear the redcoats marching down that driveway on their way to the field of battle. But as archaeologists, we attempt to look at everything. At places like this surviving roadway is an integral part of the Battle of Foulkes Mills, even though it is about 2 miles maybe from the actual battlefield itself. So it's not just the field of battle, it's where people are encamped, how they move to and from a site, how they move away from it if they've been defeated, what type of buildings are left that survive today that were there on the day of the battle, what buildings are no longer there. And things like archaeological monuments. We have a real tendency today to look at the past and landscapes almost shuttered down. We might be going on a medieval trip to a city and we look at the medieval stuff, or we might be going on a prehistoric trip looking at prehistoric elements of the landscape. But many of the monuments we see were actually there when things like battles were fought. So, for example, at Kinsale, the English troops besieging the Spaniards in the town were using medieval Irish ring forts to put their guns on. So these type of things actually often play a role in later conflict. A key thing, of course, is how battlefields have changed. If we want to understand the landscape as it is today, we have to know how it's changed. And in an Irish context, one of the biggest is enclosed or unenclosed landscape. So a lot of the medieval battles in Ireland, even a lot of the 16th century battles, would have been fought before major field systems came into play, so that the field systems that you would be looking at might not have been there. But a lot of the battles of the 1690s, of 1798, did have those field boundaries in them. And so we can start to look at the landscape and think how that might have influenced it. Reduction in woodland cover is a major thing in Ireland. Ireland is one of the least forested countries in Europe. It didn't used to be that way, though. And so we have to try and identify where there were things like woods. One of the big ones in an Irish context, though, is land improvement. Often you will hear in Ireland of a fight through a pass. This is particularly so in, for example, the Viking Age and the medieval period. And we tend to immediately conjure up in our mind's eye when we talk about a pass, a mountain pass, some sort of big physical impediment. But largely in an Irish context, it tends to refer to either a pass through a woods or a pass through a bog, through wetland, a dry area through boggy land. And any of you who've been to Ireland know that we've plenty of bog, wetland, but it's been significantly drained over the centuries. And so we have much less, and what we have is much smaller than what was there in the past. All these things play into a landscape and impact how a battle develops. Modern development is a major one. There's significant encroachment in places like New Ross, in places like the Battle of Rathmines from the Cromwellian period in Dublin, where the modern towns and cities have developed over a lot of these sites. And of course, they are significant sites of memory and commemoration often. This is an example in New Ross in County Wexford, showing the river, the town, and a 1798 pikeman. If any of you have been to Wexford or look at pictures of it, the pikeman, which is kind of the identifying weapon of the United Irishmen, is ubiquitous. There are statues and images of it everywhere. So how do you go about then reconstructing a landscape like this from an archaeological perspective? And we have a distinct methodology that we use. The first thing we do is we go back to the people who were there or who are very near contemporary of the battle. And we look for what they say. And you have to be careful about these accounts because they're very rarely neutral. Usually they're offering excuses or celebrating certain events that can muddy the waters in relation to the truth. But often they contain these things that we call locationary indicators that you can take as reliable. So for example, they may say, we crossed 2 streams and a large field before we engaged the enemy at X. And we go through these documents and we look for that type of information. We try and look at old maps, contemporary cartography, and modern cartography, new maps, to see what we can find out about how the landscape was on the day of the battle and how it's changed since then. You need to have a bit of knowledge of the military maneuvers of the day. So, for example, we know in 1798 that government troops, British troops, and it should be said, and I'll state it again in a little while, an awful lot of the British troops at places like Vinegar Hill were Irish as well. But they tended to advance in a similar fashion to we see in the American Civil War, shoulder to shoulder in a line. So that makes a difference into what type of location they'll be looking to engage in. Very important for all of these things we do in archaeology, of course, to have good walking shoes. It's just not possible to have any clue of what's going on unless you get out there and brave the cowpaths and engage in a bit of field walking for yourself. Okay, so I want to give a bit of a prelude to the Vinegar Hill element of the talk by talking about the Battle of New Ross. I mentioned earlier that the United Irishmen, as they took over, if you like, the county of Wexford, sought to press out of it. And they were beaten back as they tried to move into Wicklow at the Battle of Archaeology, and they were beaten back as they tried to move into Kilkenny at the Battle of New Ross. And this, if you like, set the scene for the government forces being able to launch multiple invasion points into the county of Wexford, ultimately defeat the rebels, the insurgents at Vinegar Hill. But the Battle of New Ross is worthy of mention because it is a savage battle and really one of the most notable urban fights that's ever taken place in Ireland. It was an attack launched on the 5th of June, so a few days after. Battle of Vinegar Hill occurs on the 21st of June, to give you a bit of a timeline. Somewhere between 10 and 15,000 rebels, a motley array of weaponry, though, mostly these pikes, maybe 1,000 to 2,000 firearms, many of which have been captured from militia units earlier in the Rising. The town is held by Lieutenant General Johnson, who is a man that we saw earlier, who was a veteran of the American Revolutionary Wars. He has 2,000 militia and various other elements of troops of kind of varying, if you like, professionalism levels. And so the United Irishmen, it's a gate, it's a walled town. The United Irishmen begin the attack by launching an assault against the gates of the town. And they successfully breach through the town, breach through these gates and engage in savage street fighting over the course of a number of hours. And eventually, though, the tide does turn, although they very, very, very nearly are victorious. And this is a scene on the right that gives you a bit of a sense of some of the horrifying fighting that went on in the town, where United Irishmen, such as those that you see on the left of the image, were charging literally into the mouths of artillery pieces that were being desperately rushed to locations such as the Thalsil shown here in the town, and they were being discharged into the faces of these men. All right, this is an urban landscape, and much of this gives you an idea. This is a map that we're doing. Enniclon and Rubicon Heritage are working on in relation to the work that we did for the Battlefields project. But this gives you an idea of the walled town. The red are the militia and the government forces. The blue are the United Irishmen. You can see where they're launching their attacks through the different locations. And the hashed area gives you an idea of the main area of fighting, the main guard there, where that artillery piece was, and where the government defences were. Some awful things happened here, like wounded United Irishmen are being burnt in buildings, wounded militiamen being killed. So pretty ruthless on both sides. There's always been a bit of an interesting element, though, to this engagement, because there was a big branch, a prong of the United Irishmen attack under this guy, Coakley here, who attempts to move forward, but for some inexplicable reason, retreats. There's nothing really in the sources about why they retreat. They were supposed to move along here and attack into the town. And we do know later that day that another United Irishman force under Cloney here attempts to move out here and is forced back by the Clare militia. All right, and I would just draw your attention to this area, which, as you can see perhaps underneath the map, and when we were doing the Battlefields project, we noted that there was greenfield elements left within this. It's a former convent. And we flagged the potential that there could be archaeology there if there was ever future works. And indeed there were. The New Ross sewage scheme went through this area. It was overseen by archaeologist Yvonne Whitty. And I had the opportunity to do a licensed metal detection survey here. Metal detection, by the way, is illegal, completely illegal in Ireland, unless you are an archaeologist. You need a license to carry it out. And this was a good demonstration of why that should be the case, because when Yvonne and her team found items, they pinpointed exactly where they found them within a field. And incredibly, they were from the 5th of June, 1798. So we found evidence for the Battle of New Ross. And it gave us an insight into small arms fire. But key here was that there was an anti-personnel, piece of anti-personnel projectile, sand or case shot. So a round that you put into the muzzle of a cannon that you fire, the bag that's holding it instantly disintegrates, and it effectively has a shotgun effect as it's fired towards attacking infantry. But there is no historical record of an artillery piece in this location during the Battle of New Ross. So what we were able to do was show that this is where this material was found. This is where I was showing you that Cloney advance. He comes out of the town here and attempts to move across and is driven back. We can now place the Clare militia line more or less precisely. But very importantly, we can also suggest that this is the probable location of an artillery piece that's not in any historical records, that is firing into the faces of these United Irishmen as they move down the road. And it's interesting to consider that this road here, the N30, is on the line of the old road where this inexplicably repulsed attack early in the morning occurs. And it does add a bit of interest, the possibility that this artillery piece was there early in the morning and that you have a bunch of, remember, untrained civilians who are coming down the road being faced in the face with a cannon. It doesn't take much imagination. I certainly know where I'd have been going, and it wasn't continuing straight on up the road. So a really good insight into even these later battles, what archaeology can tell us. Okay, I'll just spend a few minutes on Vinegar Hill before we wrap up. But as I was mentioning earlier, Vinegar Hill was the culmination of that campaign. Multiple government columns are moving towards the hill. And the 20th of June 1798 was the Battle of Foulkes Mills. That's where I was showing you that image of General Sir John Moore, where he was moving down the avenue of Longgrave House. It's Vinegar Hill, and I should have mentioned this, is in the town of Enniscorthy in County Wexford. It's a dominant hill that overlooks the entire town. And the United Irishmen selected hills like this, ones that had a really significant view of the surrounding countryside. They had actually taken Enniscorthy in another bloody battle earlier in the Rising. But the battle itself commences in the early hours of the 21st of June. And we have here we have our Gerard Lake again, who's in command, and another veteran of the American Revolutionary Wars, with 10 to 15,000 men. Many of them are Irishmen, Irish militia. Many of them are Irish Catholic men as well, I should add. There are Scottish fencibles there. There are regular British army there. And he is trying to surround the hill with these different columns under Johnson, Needham, Dundas, Duff, and Loftus. You'll also see some interesting guys here, Germans who are fighting on behalf of the British military, just as they did during the American Revolutionary Wars. And in fact, it does see the first deployment of a ironically called the Royal American Rifles, the 60th unit, who are seen as a foundational light infantry unit in British military history. They are the origin of where the Green Jackets of, if any of you have ever followed a Bernard Cornwell's Sharp series or any of those type of shows, that these are the first guys doing that since, in fact, the American Revolutionary Wars again. But in any event, the 1798, the United Irishmen then, actually, there's still a bit of doubt as to who was in overall command, if anybody was there. They tended to have a committee, and so we know these are all very famous United Irish leaders. Anthony Perry, Mo Kearns, William Barker, Thomas Clinch are all there. There's anything up to 30,000 people on the top of this hill, but an awful lot of them are what we would term non-combatants. And in fact, really, we have to think about most of these people are non-combatants. Most of them had only taken up weapons over the last few weeks, but there's thousands of women and children up there as well. They had an assortment of weaponry, most of it homemade, most of it pikes, but they had captured some firearms, and they did have some artillery pieces, though not a huge amount of capacity to use it. And this is a map that just kind of gives you an idea of the lay of the land. This is the town of Enniscorthy here, that crosses over the river. This is the high ground of Vinegar Hill, completely dominates the surrounding landscape. And you get a sense of what the government approach was. They were seeking to move in columns to attack the encampment, which was up here on the top of the hill. Johnson is advancing here, and there's a running fight down through Enniscorthy, which eventually sees an engagement here at the bridge as the different columns are pressing up the hill. And you'll note that the United Irishmen, they are defeated. I'm giving nothing away in saying that, but the last column under a guy called General Needham does not arrive. He's known to history as the late General Needham, and it prevents the trap from being closed and allows the bulk of United Irishmen to leave the hill, although they do leave behind significant casualties. Just to give you an idea of some of the landscape, this is the gap at the turn in the road where Johnson first engages United Irishmen who have some artillery up on this little hill. We can see here a windmill that's on the National Monuments Register in Ireland that sits atop Vinegar Hill, very iconic to anyone who's ever been there or anyone in the area. Looked almost identical to this on the day of battle. I was mentioning the field boundaries earlier. People tend to visit Vinegar Hill and they go to the summit and think about the battle. The United Irishmen held field boundaries significant distance out from the top of that hill, and they used the field boundaries that are still there today, these huge earthen banks, effectively as defensive positions. to force the government troops to go from ditch to ditch, if you like, in fighting them. The key to the battle, it starts with the very early hours bombardment, but eventually the government troops on a hill called Green Hill managed to do something known as enfilading the line. So they were able to fire down the length of the United Irishmen line. And they're supposed to have killed dozens of United Irishmen in their opening salvo, and it disintegrates this outer United Irishmen line and allows them, after serious fighting, to begin to push for the summit in this area. But this is the locale where that Green Hill was. Unfortunately, this is a shot taken a few years ago before it was about to be developed during the Celtic Tiger. It was a worldwide recession. It wasn't developed, but it has been developed now. So that area no longer exists. But this gives you an idea of the summit of Vinegar Hill itself, this wildly extensive view for dozens of kilometers in every direction. You can see up as far as Wicklow in many locales. And so knowing that I'm okay to go for about another 10 minutes, would that be? Yeah, is that okay? Yeah, so I always talk too long on these different sections. But in any event, we might be here for a few days yet, you never know. Locally, Wexford County Council had the foresight, together with Knights and Rebels, which is a fantastic exhibition centre dedicated to 1798 in Enniscorthy, to form the Longest Day project. A key element of which, it had a number of elements. A book has come out of it now on 1798 in Vinegar Hill. But a key element of it was to conduct an archaeological survey, the largest one yet undertaken. I was fortunate enough to direct the archaeological elements of that work when I was at Rubicon Heritage, but it was an international team, and we had IT Sligo archaeologists, we had geophysics from Earth Sound, and we had specialists from Cotswold Archaeology in England with us. So we were looking to identify the extent of the battle, if we could find any areas of fighting, any possible mass graves, and look to set some standards for what could be achieved at a site like Vinegar Hill if you explored it. So as I was mentioning, metal detection in Ireland requires a license from the state, from the National Monument Service and the National Museum. Every object in the ground that has no known owner is, by Irish law, the property of the Irish people. And the national monuments have responsibility then for ensuring that there's no damage to archaeological sites, which stops unlicensed detection. And you'll see why the careful recording that archaeologists do was really important on this site, because we used a systematic survey technique. So every find we got, we knew to within centimeters where it was found. And so we had a very strict methodology. We would detect along 2.5 meter transects, as we call them, with a detector, investigating all non-iron targets. So we were specifically looking for lead bullets and things like that. And then we've been, and are just wrapping up actually, the last of our specialist analysis. Many of the items have been conserved. But we did 2 main phases of survey work there, and the first was in May 2017. And as the field director of the project, I can tell you I was a very worried boy after a week on this, because we had to concentrate on fields under pasture, because some of the fields that we really wanted to get into were under crop that had to be harvested. Some areas of the hill had been converted into a golf course, which had destroyed any archaeology largely underneath it. But so we spent a week detecting in these fields. Just to give you an idea, this is a long, narrow laneway that brings you to the top of Vinegar Hill. This is where the car park is, the monument. This is where visitors, a couple of you may well have been here, visitors go from this car park up to the top of the hill here. And so these were the fields we were detecting. And we found 1 bullet, 1. But we did find other stuff that was quite important. We did find evidence for the civilians, for the 1798 encampment. So things like little buckles, buttons, keys that were deposited there during the battle. But we didn't find overwhelming evidence for the engagement that followed. This just gives you an idea of some of the range of finds material and where we were finding it within the fields. But we returned in September of 2017 to get into the fields that we were particularly keen on. And again, just to orientate you, this is the laneway that takes you to the summit of Vinegar Hill. This is the car park with the memorial. This is the peak. This is the windmill that you'll be familiar with. And we went into these fields in particular, and it produced the largest assemblage of military material ever found on a battlefield in Ireland. The place was just littered with signs of an engagement. You can see the type of landscape here. Just to give you an orientation here, this is that laneway I was mentioning in this bottom photo. You can just see the top of the windmill here, and you can see the team advancing. Much as we now know, the Redcoats advanced in line straight up this field into the face of desperately fighting United Irishmen. There was hand-to-hand combat in this field. This is the type of material that started emerging almost instantaneously. These are fired bullets, fired that are striking the ground at very close range. These were formerly spherical balls. You can see here some of them have been sheared off because of the force as they're being fired at such close range into the soil uphill. And they just started coming up in their dozens, all the way up through the hill, everywhere. So every one of them are bullets. And what we now know, you can see this is a distribution of bullets we have here. What we now know is that this, as we had it in 2006, should be over here. And that what we're getting is a line of redcoats advancing through this field and up towards the summit of the hill. And indeed, this laneway, which everybody drives up now, thinking little of, and there have been some talk that perhaps maybe it should be widened to make it easier for buses, etc., to access the top of the hill. We now know that the government forces in this area of the battlefield actually orientated their right flank on this road. And any of you familiar with American Civil War battlefields know that you're trying to get a few hundred guys in a line, shoulder to shoulder. It's not easy to do. And generally, they try and take a landscape feature to orientate them on, so that you can put the right of the line on this line and say, okay, guys, you stay beside the laneway as you march up, and all the rest of the line is oriented on them. And so we got this distribution, which suggests that the line was stopping at the base of this hill to fire into the United Irishmen before they advance. Yeah, at least 3 different types of guns were found, heavily impacted bullets. We even have anti-personnel artillery, even though we weren't looking for it. We know that a light artillery piece was wheeled into this field during the advance to fire those anti-personnel projectiles that we saw at New Ross, identical to them, again, into the faces of United Irishmen standing only yards away. But we also found evidence for hand-to-hand fighting here. The United Irishmen put up an incredible last stand defense, a number of them, particularly men from Wicklow, to try and hold open the escape route for the people on top of the hill. And that appears to have occurred in this area. We have elements here of broken off pistol and elements, for a couple of elements, different elements from the body of the gun. Things like the lock of a musket that was carried into battle. These illustrations, by the way, by the late F. Glenn Thompson. And there's the case shot, sand shot, as we call it, that we know was fired in this field. So we now know that in this field that there were significant deaths. When we walk in it, we know that it was a horrifying location on the 21st of June, 1798. We found bullets from the South, or buttons rather, from the South Cork militia, which incredibly allows us to identify the specific unit that is attacking in this area, because the South Cork militia were not at the Battle of Vinegar Hill, but their light companies were. These, if you like, higher trained light infantry companies that were attached to every regiment had been taken off of their individual regiments and put into, if you like, a light regiment. So we know that the South Cork militia were in this field. But we also have an idea of the United Irishmen they were fighting, because one of the finds was a token from a mine in Cronban in County Wicklow. And we know that there were South Wicklow United Irishmen fighting on Vinegar Hill. And the odds are that this was dropped by one of them. So for the first time on an Irish site like this, we have actually an idea of specific men fighting on either side. And that's one of the things battlefield archaeology gives to you that often we don't get from the higher level history sources. It's this kind of individual story, an individual Wicklow United Irishman who has his token from his mine in South Wicklow is fighting there, trying to desperately hold open from fellow countrymen in large part advancing to try and destroy them. So that to conclude, I suppose that it gives us there's a lot of pluses. We have significant new information on the battlefield. We were only there for 2 weeks and really only found this material in 1 week with a small team. There's significant opportunities. You could go back there for years. Huge interpretation opportunities because we can tell so much about what happens in this field in particular. This is the view, by the way, that the United Irishmen would have had down the hill as these redcoats were advancing up them, much as the detectorists, the archaeologists here, are advancing up towards the camera. We know, though, that things were lost. We know that this development in the background and a very, very new development right here have destroyed elements of this part of the battlefield. Because we know that the government forces swept over this hill, down the saddle here and up. And we know that illegal metal detection, which is unfortunately on the significant rise in Ireland, will have a major impact on sites like this because, we were able to determine where lines of men are standing within yards. But even if you just know that the bullet is from this field, it's lost all its meaning because we're unable to position it in relation to what we now know is occurring when you get significant numbers of them laid out. So we're in the analysis phase. I'm just finishing it up, but doing things like, for example, from our fine spot of where we got that little bit of anti-personnel shot, the sand shot. Again, this is our laneway here. This is where we have men advancing. It was found here. We can see this is the likely location that the cannon was in because of its range, its effective range, and maximum range. So this is the type of thing we're doing. We're actually very close to finishing that up. And as I say, there is a great book, Last Stand, at Vinegar Hill, which is very well worth getting. We have a chapter in it about some of our preliminary results, but we'll have a bit more. So yeah, I'll leave it there at that. Just again to acknowledge, it was a good friend of mine, F. Glenn Thompson, who did a great book on the uniforms of 1798 to 1803. Unfortunately passed away now, but Glenn's stuff is coming very useful for all of our subsequent analysis. Okay, thanks very much.
My God, Damian, that's fascinating. I mean, it's incredible what you're able to reconstruct, and I suppose we grew up with the songs about it and everything, and you kind of think you know what's happening, and then to see, first of all, how disciplined and maybe the numbers like that were involved. I don't think I ever knew there was that many Irish, and as you said, it's kind of scary to think women and children are just kind of camp followers are going along, how many of them got caught like in the crossfire.
Yeah, so and I mean, we know how notorious it was for its impact on, if you like, civilians. Yeah. Like it took Wexford a long time to recover from that.
Yeah. And was that the armed forces, like just an attrition, a kind of a scorched earth policy, or are they killing, willy-nilly?
There are known atrocities on it would have to be said on both sides. There's a very infamous burning of Protestants at Scullabogue, in Wexford. But you would have to say on the balance, it is largely the government side that are engaged in it. The famous incidents of things like pitch capping. There's horrendous scenes in Wexford town during this period. It's first taken by the United Irishmen and they lose control of things a bit, and there's a series of executions of Protestants off the bridge, and then when it's taken back off them, there's another series of executions of United Irishmen off the bridge. So really, anybody who was anywhere around Wexford that summer was liable to be killed. Some of the estimates are horrific in terms of how many people lost their lives there, because it was just practically lawless, in terms of what could happen. Certainly, I would say the most devastating conflict of its type like that well, certainly from the 1690s, but probably since the mid 17th century in terms of what's going on
God,
around the
yeah.
county in terms of people being killed.
Yeah, because I mean that's the thing we posted recently about Drogheda like and Cromwell, and that seems to have been fairly horrific. But this is obviously on a scale. Will you tell the people what pitch capping is, just while we have you?
Oh yes, sorry, yeah, it's putting tar on someone's head and
Yeah.
then setting it alight. Yeah, and there's kind of people who became famous for being very tall, and then he would hang people off his shoulder and stuff like that. And as you say, Elizabeth, like the way it's become so ingrained in Irish folk, from songs through to everything. Like it's absolutely ingrained in this event. But again, quite restricted in its area, the area it impacted. Like it was nothing like a nationwide event. Like there were 7 suspected United Irishmen being executed all over the country after it, but very restricted in the areas that it impacted hugely.
Yeah. Well, that was actually one of my first questions. That early map that you put up, like nothing happening in Munster.
No.
And so is that because, I mean, you think of the Desmond Rebellion, the castle in Listowel is the last one to fall against Queen Elizabeth I, like not long before she dies, or it might even have been just after she died, around 1603, I think our castle fell. Is there no activity, or do we not have the Protestant leadership in Munster? Like, what's happening there?
There had been a very successful effort at suppression leading up to it. So there were significant amounts of arrests going on all over the place of people who were suspected that they might be causing a rising. And there were also major operations all over the place, Munster included, to and like a lot of it going on in Munster, to de-weaponize the civilian population. So going around and gathering arms and putting orders out to take weapons in. And all of that seems to have had a very stifling impact, together with the kind of chaotic start of the rising and the communications being so poor, that it led to an awful lot of people not coming out as it had been intended. It's almost more remarkable, I think, that Wexford does
come out
to the extent it does.
After
given
the mess in
everything
Mayo, like in Cork. Well, it reminds me of 1916 Rising, like with the ad in the paper, cancel the manoeuvres, and then like one fella in Tralee does it anyway, and a couple in Ashburn, crazy, and
as I'd be quick to tell you, in Wexford, some of them did come out as well, 16, and they get forgotten about.
Oh yeah, we were into Dublin, we were there, But, there's a lot of kind of sitting back.
Yeah, it's really. I mean, there were people, where I lived in East Cork for a long time. There were people killed there in 1798, executed. And there were some some small engagements, but very much, it was something that people look back on, and interesting even because you see it coming right through into kind of the 1916 thing, where people are saying, well, my grandfather was out in 1867 or 1848, and his grandfather was out in 1798 or whatever. It's kind of like the start of this long tradition. But of course, it's also a kind of a moment that gets spoken about quite a bit as a kind of a what might have been moment, because it's a union of, and of course it wasn't as smooth as all that. Many elements of what happened in Wexford were particularly sectarian between Catholic and Protestant, but it was a movement on its whole that had united Presbyterians and Catholics in a way like that was never grasped afterwards.
Absolutely.
Particularly when we're looking at subsequent history in Northern Ireland. So a fascinating rebellion for all of the elements that we discussed, and for that huge international impact that it has afterwards.
And it seems way more organized, and even though it wasn't national, much bigger than 1848. Like, it's a little bit embarrassing in a way, like Mrs. whatever her name is, Potato Patch in Ballingarry. Like, there isn't an 1848 rebellion really,
No. And I mean, you could even say, to the extent that there's a 66 and 67. I mean, the major problems were always an infiltration of informants. That the Dublin Castle, that the government was always
able to get
sometimes better informed than the leadership as to what was happening. But the key thing, particularly in places like Wexford, seems to have been the strength of, effectively, they were organizing it on local kind of almost parish level, that it was and so it was up to those different units to rise. when the moment came
Yeah.
to try and make it, and that seems to have been particularly strong in Wexford, so that they kind of all come together. And then the initial success is always a big thing, you know, like most of those Wexford groups had some sort of, you know, a kind of a quick win against some militia who were in the county. And there were militiamen all over the country who were there, like trying to pin down, you know, make sure there was nothing going to happen.
Yeah.
It's important too to remember the terror. I think we often forget it when we look around Ireland with all our defences, you know, from the Napoleonic period. But there was a real terror, particularly after 1796, that the French were going to land significant troops in Ireland, like, and
Yeah.
so the kind of the ultimate British response was always going to be fairly to try and really hammer it down to prevent that. Because even later with the Napoleonic wars, there was another threatened invasion, and the concern that the Irish would do what they'd done in 1798, or at least elements of them.
Well, and you know, I was going to ask you too about the fact that so many of the British had been in the United States Revolution. Like, do you think that made them more determined, like, to win this one? Or I'm wondering what impact that had on them.
No, it's an interesting question. Like, they would have certainly been familiar with the type of, I mean, early in the American Revolution, you know, they would have been familiar with the type of warfare that came. It's a really interesting conflict, I think, for British military history, but it doesn't get looked at all really by British military historians. I think largely because it's seen as a bit embarrassing to discuss what went on there. But you have these kind of old guard, and then you have the new guards, like, who are coming through, revolutionizing in many ways British military thought and how they're fighting things. But it gave an awful lot of those guys initial combat experience that they otherwise mightn't have had. For the other guys, I mean, they were towards the end of their career, many of them, that whether they might have been a bit stuck in their ways in some instances. I think you can certainly discern a difference in the way many would treat American subjects versus Irish subjects in this sort of scenario. There is a difference in how they are regarded, by which the Irish are seen as inferior. There was always much more of a willingness to
just kill them.
to just kill, kill. And in fairness now to many of them, like, you know, they tried to restrain their men, but like one of the reasons Francis Needham is supposed to have been late to Vinegar Hill is because they were busy killing people along the road that they'd encountered. So you know, not all of them were like that. John Moore wasn't supposed to be bad in terms of this, but there was a bit of an individual element to it. And I think perhaps maybe the real lessons are how you see kind of indigenous populations being treated versus Irish. Is a kind of a close parallel. Closer parallel. The indigenous experience is much worse, but
but it's true. Like, you know, when I read Kenny's article years ago on the Atlantic Worlds, you know, and like the Irish Celt or the Catholic had kind of stood in all the language that they use against indigenous peoples later on. They'd used in Ireland, you know, in the 1500s to describe the Irish Catholic, you know.
It is. It's the Ireland is the testing ground.
We're like a prototype kind of colony.
Absolutely.
And then it is interesting too that so many of the British troops were Irish. I mean, this kind of continues right up to the, you know, the Royal Irish Constabulary, into, you know, Michael Collins sending threatening letters. Like, I mean, for those people, and we can't talk about, I suppose, like performance or motive. Obviously, they're doing it because it's a job. You know, it's a very poor economy. But do you think foot soldiers who were Irish and possibly Catholic, you know, were they, I mean, at that point it's fight or be killed, I guess, kill or be killed. So, you know,
it's an interesting one. Like, the United Irish narrative has won over, I suppose you would say, in our, you know, because we're an independent nation now and everything. But you would, like, I mean, the most notorious unit in all of Wexford is the North Cork Militia. You know, and so there are other, now there's a good few of them are actually Church of Ireland men, but I think the majority of them in that instance. But Yeah, it's an interesting one because they are in large part looking for their own financial gain.
Yeah.
Or a lot of the militia were very badly treated anyway because a lot of them had enlisted on the basis that they weren't going to be employed beyond their own county. And then they are, and so it's a fairly tough existence for a lot of them. But yeah,
And I
like
mean, we know army life was horrific. They're whipping and there's all kinds of flogging going on. It's not like
yeah,
they were
yeah,
treated
yeah,
any
yeah.
better, yeah.
Yeah, but we do have a bit of a blind spot, I think, for them. I always think of O'Brien of Thomond, who's knighted on the field at Kinsale, for his
Yeah.
services to the crown. These are there's always Irish on both sides. It's never that easy. And I always think it was the great success of the British Empire was their capacity to do that. Like their small regular forces were always and of course, we're quite close at this point because there's huge numbers of Irish Catholics are about to are just being released into the main British army at this period where Catholics. So by the time Wellington is fighting in the Napoleonic Wars, there's huge numbers of Catholics fighting in his forces. During the American Revolution, officially Catholics weren't supposed to be in the British army, although there were significant numbers. But you're seeing that sea change. But the British always have been excellent at doing that. That's how you hold down an empire. You have small numbers
Is
of your
recruit
own regular
locally.
troops.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And tell me, sorry.
No, you're fine. You're fine.
Well, I was going to ask you, it's kind of a weird question, and maybe it's evident. Were the bodies moved, Damien, off the fields at the time? I don't hear talking about
I didn't
bones.
actually get into that. Yeah.
Yeah.
So the archaeology we're doing on mass graves is kind of producing interesting stuff at the moment because it's suggesting that they often aren't. That there's a few things that tend to it's common to a lot of mass graves. There tends to be a laziness about it that people are put in
just pits.
Single pits, in pits, in like groups of pits, but multiple bodies are put into them, which can be incredibly small. It's amazing how small they can be. But they tend to be close to things like roadways, because if you think about it, if you're throwing dead bodies on a cart or something, like people aren't going far. They're making it as easy as possible.
Yeah. And there might be a ditch already dug or something.
Well, this is the interesting thing at Vinegar Hill. So the geophysics that was carried out by Earthsound and the team from Sligo did find near the top, very close to the car park there, potential pits. Now they're very square cut. We didn't excavate them because there was no need to be excavating them, to be honest. We don't need to be doing that. And obviously it's a major undertaking to do that. But they're very square lined, and we know that there were quarry pits at the top of Vinegar Hill. And if I was looking anywhere and I thought there was going to be quarry pits up there and a load of people then subsequently die, that would be where I'd be expecting them to go, like a pre-existing hole that you can then just kind of cover over and things like that. So that's likely where many of them are, but there's probably a few multiples of them around the field because there were people killed like a few hundred meters out from that location. But exactly, it's pre-existing things like ditches or quarries that we'd expect them to be in. And I wouldn't be surprised at all if those quarry pits at the top that we found have bodies in them.
Yeah, gee, that's kind of incredible that they're there, without a burial,
And the same on most battlefields across Ireland. Like we excavated one. I have a cold, but we excavated one from 1642 in Dublin, and it was quite incredible. It was a really, really shallow. It was men, women, and children, largely women and children, who had been killed when the castle had fallen on the 27th of March. And they killed everyone. And you can tell an awful lot from those
the death, like the skeletons will have evidence of bones being cut or hacked.
So like in that 1642 mass grave we excavated at Carrick Mines in County Dublin, we know they were killed quickly, kind of, when people say, someone's killed in cold blood. Well, this is somebody killed in hot blood.
Because it poured.
It's they poured into the castle. Some of them had bludgeoning injuries where it looks like the reverse of a musket. Some of them had sharp cut injuries in position that looks like they were either on the ground or being struck by guys on horseback with swords. Others had been shot. and then they were put in a very kind of jumbled fashion into this very shallow grave.
Wow.
And you get like, you know, one woman had attempted to sew coins into her clothing, we think.
Oh yeah.
And there was a key, which was a kind of a significant thing in the mid 17th century context, because there wasn't that many things with locks
Yeah.
found. So you get these kind of real personal insights into, you know, the last horrible moments of a person's life. Like,
Yeah, that she obviously thought she was running, but she had secured and to come back later on, you know, yeah.
yeah, that's it. That's exactly
Wow.
it. But didn't make it.
And the case shot that you were talking about, was that basically like a prototypical shrapnel? You know, was it expected to kind of explode, or was it
Yeah,
just?
so you see it. There's a few different types. You see it in the American Civil War as well, and so the kind of shrapnel ones tend to be fired kind of across longer range, usually, but they can be used this way as well. But effectively, what it is either there's a couple of different types, which you get them either a canvas bag or a kind of a tin can, and it's filled with balls. And so the idea is that when it's fired, the second it hits the muzzle, the canvas bag or the tin around it disintegrates, and it just sends out a cone of these small little missiles, of canister, if you like. That's you use usually when infantry or whoever is within, you know, about 50 or 100 meters of where it is, and it's absolutely devastating.
Yeah.
So it was quite similar. I mean, there's only, you know, 63 years between this and the Civil War, quite similar to the type of thing that you'd be seeing on battlefields like Gettysburg. You know, when the Confederates are coming up in Pickett's charge, this is what the type of thing they're getting it right in the face as they're approaching that line. So, like, horrific weapons.
Yeah, and like as you said, you know, they're carrying pikes and sticks and whatever.
Yeah.
You know, I
Yeah.
definitely would have been running back down the hill, like, or
Yeah.
I mean, you
Yeah.
know,
Like the hand-to-hand fighting at the top of that hill is a real good indicator, I think, of what, like, there was a designated group who volunteered, I suppose, to try and hold it so
yeah,
that they could keep the escape route open. And I
yeah,
doubt many of them got off the field.
no,
But the fact that we have the hand-to-hand elements there, like that broken weaponry and stuff, it tends to be indicative of close quarter
yeah. That like
fighting.
the stock of my gun hit yours
Yeah,
and broke
yeah,
off.
exactly, and breaks. Yeah,
Yeah,
so it shows that they didn't all, and like that was an incredible sacrifice to be making, really,
yeah.
at that juncture. Yeah,
Well, and
to
what's
stand in the face of it.
yeah, and what's incredible to me too, you were saying like it's almost a committee that's running the Irish side, you know, like
Yeah,
so like
yeah.
they're not trained, they're not disciplined, they're not in
No,
formation, they don't have weapons. It's incredible they
they
stood at all, like, you know.
it is. They do seem to be ideologically driven, of
Yeah,
course, which are a lot of them at least are, which is
yeah.
going to help you in a scenario like that, as opposed to, I suppose, if the boot was in the other foot and you weren't really, you know.
Yeah, if you hadn't bought into the cause, like, yeah.
Yes,
But it's
exactly,
incredible
exactly.
that it takes you that far, you know. I mean, yeah.
Yeah.
And
They were
then
brave people.
they really were, you know, yeah, we need to, I think, kind of look at how we teach it again, maybe, you know, like it's, I think it's primary school, maybe first year, you know, in high school is the last time I looked at it, you know, aside from
Yeah,
the songs, you know.
yeah.
And then I
It's
had, oh, tell me.
Yeah. Oh no, sorry. Go on. No, I'm just saying it's the individual stuff that's incredible, because we don't have the ordinary people stuff for most of these battles. But
Yeah,
every single one of those objects, like we have things there, for example, at the bottom of the hill, there's a number of unfired bullets, which is almost certainly nervous
yeah,
soldiers not loading their guns
not getting
properly
it
and
in.
dropping
Yeah,
things. They're dropping things all around them because
yeah,
they're under fire.
yeah,
None of them would have been in a major battle like that before. So it's
yeah.
it's all those kind of individual personal elements.
Yeah. Well, and I think, you know, I can't remember if it was you or another historian on the Civil War that was talking about like needing your teeth, you know, to open
Yes.
the
Yeah.
bullet, and so Irish
Yeah.
people were malnourished and their teeth were terrible, and you know, you
Yeah.
couldn't get the fucking
There's
powder
been
in.
bodies found in Ireland on sites. Clonmel is one that springs to mind, where bullets have been found in the mouth, because a lot of soldiers, and this actually occurred as well, in things like the American Revolution, they would carry the bullets in their mouth, because spitting them into the muzzle gave them a precious few extra seconds than trying to fumble in a pouch trying to get them out. So everything is about trying to be able to fire as quickly as possible.
Yeah, to walk and chew gum, like.
Yeah, exactly. And every one of them is just a little bit of individualism or whatever that you see from these sites of kind of, if you like, the ordinary people that we tend not to get. So that's how it's connected to the pension files from the Civil War.
Yeah, exactly. And just to ask you about the women and children, were they coming because like there was no point them staying at home if the lad was fighting, nobody was going to be farming the land, or why are women and kids going with them?
Well, I think a lot, anyway, with the women, I think a lot of the women are
fighting too somehow.
Well, yeah, some of them certainly, I would say. Yeah. There is a couple of instances. I think New Ross is one of them. But like I would say, many of them share views. But I think a key thing to remember as well is the safety element of it, because Wexford's not a huge county, and really the kind of lines are very porous, and there's different groups. There's like local militias out all the time, local yeomanry from Wexford who are pretty indiscriminate if they come across other people. That was one of the big Catholic Protestant divides there. And so, like, if you were a family in your isolated farmstead, you were seriously vulnerable. Whereas, there is I suppose a feeling of safety in numbers. And certainly for the camp was up there for a couple of weeks, so it was effective at that time. And it should be said, I suppose, at the camp, like, there were things like executions being carried out as well. So like they weren't all angels by any stretch of the imagination. There was quite close to where that major field where we found material, we know there were executions being carried out among people up at the top. So
that maybe discipline wasn't great or something.
I know a lot of them would have been locals on the other side of things. So it's always this element of kind of civil war aspect of it that you see in a lot of Irish wars that doesn't get discussed as much beyond our own Civil War. But like 1798 has significant elements of civil war to it, even though the whole thing is a wider question, and you can see that even in the 1640s. You can see it nearly all the way. There's always a significant, if you like, Irish on Irish element in most of these conflicts.
Yeah, which, as you say, probably goes along sectarian, kind of lines.
Often it does. When you go back a bit, it goes on what am I getting out of it lines. If you're the local lord or whatever, they would have no compunction about allying with the crown over other Irish people, because they're getting more out of it. Again, which is another classic success of the British Empire. They were really good at doing that.
Divide and conquer.
Yes.
And the metal detector that I posted about the Ardagh chalice recently. The anniversary of it being found a couple of months. Is the law since then, or was that always the law that
it was? And I would have to say, my house where I grew up, what used to be the only house in the same house where the same town land where the Ardagh chalice was found. My claim to fame.
Wow.
So I've done a few bits and pieces on the Ardagh chalice before. But the Derry na Flan hoard was the one that kind of changed the law on that, which was found in the late 1980s in Tipperary. It's very similar to the Ardagh hoard. It's early.
Were they the family that sued? Like he had permission to be on the land,
and in the end it was determined that actually archaeological material should be the property of the people of the state, not an individual who happens to own the land.
It or to be
Which surprisingly is progressive. Surprisingly progressive property element of law in Ireland, I thought.
I know.
It's significantly better than the law in England. And I'm sure, and you probably have listeners who wouldn't agree with it, I would imagine. There's a lot, but battlefield archaeology has been a big problem with it, because battlefields and military stuff tend to be the sites that get most hit with illegal detection. Because often historically they've had the least protection. Because there's usually no obvious castle or ring fort which has been illegal to go on as well. But you can see when you start to plot the stuff in minute detail. Number one, that it can tell you stuff that just finding them in the field doesn't tell you. And number two, I mean, I genuinely don't feel it's right for material like that, like bullets that have passed through people, kind of personal objects like that. It's I do have a bit of an issue in relation to some of those Irish sites. Say that material there, like that, really it should be there for everyone as an interpretive tool, so that they can kind of get more in touch with the actual events on the day. So for those two reasons in particular, but plus it helps us to protect these sites. So again, you know, without that material there, we wouldn't know that laneway that's going to the top was there on the day of the battle and plays an important role in it. You know, so it's these small objects in the ground and where they are telling us about the importance of the other stuff in the landscape too. So it's really, really key to try and protect them.
Well, so I think I hope I've asked questions that my the members would have thought of. If not, we were saying like they can type the questions into the Facebook comments and you'll answer them.
I'll try and answer any questions I can in the Facebook comments after.
Good. And we'll have you back for sure to talk about the Andersonville and the tell me again the
Civil War Blue Jackets, so
the Blue Jackets.
We're looking for volunteers to help transcribe.
That sounds absolutely fascinating, though. You know, and people love that stuff. Like, it's particularly the American Civil War is such a, you know, kind of amateur historian. You know, there's all these roundtables and reenactors. So we hope that we get the word out.
With a kind of our selfish Irish hats on in relation to the Navy, we're transcribing muster rolls of the Union Navy, but like 20% of those lads were born in Ireland, and there was probably about 35% are Irish American. So it's telling you a huge amount about Irish, really the poorest of the poor Irish in that period. So well,
and so you have access to all the material that you want people to transcribe.
We've set up a project on a thing called Zooniverse, which is a crowdsourcing platform where you get citizen scientists, and so we have the muster rolls up there, and volunteers come to the site and can select what they want to do, whether they want to transcribe people's names or their rank or their ages or where they were born. And you just fill it out. It's a really simple one. But I'd love to. We'll do a thing. I'll do a quick chat through it maybe.
I would love that, and I think our members would too. You know, I think it would be great.
Brilliant.
Thank you for shining a light on this, you know, kind of historic battle, but it's surprising how little we knew about it in one way, you know, and so Vinegar Hill is absolutely iconic, as we said, in Irish kind of mythology almost. You know, but it's great to see, to kind of reenact Battle of them, what happened that week and what the decisions they had to make. So we appreciate you. We'll definitely have you back on to talk about the Blue Jackets project and the Civil War again.
Thanks a million, Elizabeth. Cheers.
Not at all, delighted. Thanks so much, David. Bye. Take care. Thank you.